Hey Untold Radio Network fans, want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Greetings, all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and as always, I'm delighted that you are watching me either live tonight on YouTube or Facebook or X, or whether you're catching the show after tonight on one of those sites where it's archived, or on essentially any podcast platform where the audio version goes out. So thank you for being with me. I had a great day today. I hope everybody else out there did as well. I got the official notification. You get kind of an unofficial notification, then you get the official notification saying, okay, you can announce now that my short film, The Shaver Mystery, which is kind of an extracted segment from my feature I'm always talking about, The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, and it's just a segment about the Shaver Mystery, is a screening at next month's Sydney Underground Film Festival. And it's screened at a number of festivals now, and this is probably the one I'm most excited about to date because I was a regular attendee at that festival in Sydney. The festival's now been going for something like 20 years, and when I was in Sydney, I would go every single season. I loved the festival. It's an amazing event. So for those of you who want to see my film, you can see it as part of a shorts documentary program which is playing on September 13th at 4 p.m. at Dendy Cinema, Newtown. But there's so much else in the festival that's screening to check out. So go to suf.com.au for details about The Shaver Mystery or for anything else which is screening. But other than that, for people who might live closer than Sydney, Australia, I have another screening I'm super excited about coming up this Friday night, which is going to take place at In the Pines Studio, which is a new arts venue in Stevens Point, which is in Portage County, central Wisconsin. And why this is such a wonderful screening is Portage County is where Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver both lived for an extended period of time. And is the reason I started making this documentary in the first place, because it's just down the road from me. And that's at 7 p.m. next Friday night. People can just go to the Facebook page for The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers and The Shaver Mystery. You can find it easily by going to theshavermystery.com, and then you can find out where all up-and-coming screenings are, including more details for the In the Pines screening. I will be there introducing the film and Q&Aing, and it's going to be followed by the amazing Fritz Lang masterpiece, Metropolis. So that's going to be one heck of a night, which I'm really looking forward to. So people in the area, please come and hang out with me and check out the film, particularly if you haven't caught it at any other festival yet. It's also a great day because I have an incredible guest joining me who has been on the show before, and she's always so delightful to talk to, and she's just loaded with fascinating information. She's an independent researcher of the elusive and often maligned Pukwudgie. That's a diminutive forest-dwelling humanoid and trickster of Wampanoag folklore. She was born and raised in Connecticut. Her focus has been in the rich history of strange and spooky encounters in New England, and she is currently working on what sounds like an absolutely fascinating archival project of we folk sightings and related phenomena across the country. She's the host of this High Strangeness Factor with the show's good friends Steve Ward and Andy Mercer on the Paranormal UK radio network. And tonight she's returning to Talking Weird to chat about her research into ancient stone sites and the mysteries that they present, including her own paranormal experience at one such location. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back to the show, Susy Bastille. Greetings.
Hey, Dean.
So good to have you back.
I'm super excited to be back.
You've been busy since we last chatted as well. I hinted at some of it on there, including jumping into the High Strangeness Factor with Steve and Andy now.
Yeah, I'm being a bad influence on them. Getting to talk weird with them on a regular basis is so much fun. Both of them are a wealth of knowledge in different areas. So they're great co-hosts to do a show with, for sure.
Oh, I bet. I love having Steve on the show. I've got to get Andy on Talking Weird at some stage as well, because Steve's must have been on almost half a dozen times since this show's been going for the last 4 years or however long we've been banging around for now. And one thing I've noticed on your Facebook page is always popping up on my feed, and I think we're going to talk about some of that tonight as well, is you're constantly out in the field in woods and weird ancient, rock or ancient stone site locations, just digging into the weird. So what kind of made you go out there and want to start doing this type of field research? It's fascinating.
Well, even like before I met you, I did like to go in caves. So I promise I don't just do it to make you nervous.
And it does because of the shaver stuff, just to qualify for those people who don't understand. If you go into the caverns too often, Susie, the Darrow are going to get you. I'm just warning you about that.
I have yet to meet the Darrow, but I have always had a fascination with old stone sites. I actually grew up on one. I grew up on a property called Spring Hill Farm, and there were natural springs, and the way indigenous people used to mark them so they could find them easily is by creating what we call serpent effigies. So they're stone walls, but more kind of like winding and snaking. Some of them have what they call a heartstone, which is usually like a big piece of quartz there, and they point towards the springs. So I grew up around those. And I also had a spooky grandma around who would do things like leave offerings for the forest spirits before we'd go on a walk and things like that. It took me way too long to kind of connect her interests with my current interests. But, eventually through doing more and more research and getting out more, I did kind of start to make the connection between stone sites and the paranormal. And I just kind of want to preface all of this by saying, I know about where I live, but I think this occurs in other places. If there's one thing New England is not short on, it's stones. But you have similar things that happen in other places. Andy Mercer, my co-host, introduced me to the theory that the ley lines that originated in England, but we talk about it all over the world now. One of the theories is that those were actually created by humans traveling the same paths for years and years. So even if your area doesn't have stone sites, you might have other places that have kind of accumulated energy over the years.
I saw the Dead End Collective, thank you for watching, mentioned a minute ago, we should have a lot in common with the good people of Ireland. And I assume the traditions in Ireland of old forts, for example, old Neolithic type structures, there's an idea that the fair folk are associated with those places, often dwelling beneath them or dwelling in them or traveling along things much like ley lines, these lines which run between the various ancient Neolithic sites where supposedly the fair folk will travel, and it's meant to be very bad luck or unfortunate to build your house between one of these two structures along the lines that the fair folk might travel. There's similar type of legends regarding the perhaps bad luck of building something near these things or between these things in New England? Do you know?
Well, so in colonial New England, we liked to build things on top of indigenous sites. There are some colonial graveyards at some of these sites, as well as like old foundations of colonial settlements too. And I know that one particular site near me, the family that built their home right next to this site, things did not seem to go well for them at all.
Huh.
So, you have that one anecdotal story, but there's also, little people in general all over the place. There are stories of, people building a home and later on realizing that there were little people there, and then their life just kind of goes right in the garbage and things start falling apart after that.
Is that the type of entities that your grandmother was talking about when she was talking about the forest spirits or forest people or whatever term you used, or was she talking about a different kind of entity?
I think it's something along the same lines, at least at a minimum. She might not have had a word for it, but I do think that these are entities that are connected to the land itself. Um, Possibly even, we talk about like poltergeist being caused by human energy. It's possible that, forest spirits are maybe caused by, the energy of the people that have been there, but also with the element of nature there as well. Because you don't see Pukwudgies in the city, you see them in the swamp, in the woods, and things like that.
Yeah, it's interesting how there's often there tends to be a rural attachment or a rural association with a lot of these things. You know what I mean? The idea that they exist outside the realms of more civilized society. And sometimes that's just rurally. It doesn't always have to be in the backwoods. But there are probably, I'm guessing, less tales in cities of these type of things, right?
Yeah, definitely. I don't recall, definitely not any locally, but I don't even recall any in other regions of the world.
Yeah, no, I can't. I mean, I'm sure there must be in some more built up areas. Like they must still have ideas of some type of entity. I guess I'm not sure. I'm thinking. I wonder in Japan if there were traditions, because you think about the type of horror movies, which are sometimes the J horror, which is sometimes based on these type of entities, and you wonder if areas which were always had a larger populace, if they still had to have some type of mythology attached. In fact, that'd be an interesting book or an interesting study, the comparison of rural and urban approaches. I'm sure somebody must have written it. It's begging to be written if they haven't,
Yeah.
as far as those type of different regional approaches to the supernatural. Tell us about some of the places you've located recently. Are there places which you've been to which you think are particularly significant, or where you've had, stranger feelings than others? Or
Yeah, so I'll start with my first paranormal experience, which after, almost being bitter about never having seen anything, finally did for the first time. It was early this spring. Um, I was at a site which was an indigenous ceremonial site, and it was something, or I was actually following GPS coordinates out into the woods because it didn't have an address to get to, so it's a little bit out there. Um, this was, midday, broad daylight, and I looked up and I saw an orb, a light orb, um, probably about the size of a beach ball
wow,
and maybe like the distance of a school bus away from me, red, and then it turned orange. Lasted maybe like 15 seconds or so and kind of like disappeared behind a tree and was nowhere to be found. Um, and because I'm me and I don't see these type of things, I immediately get out my phone. I check the humidity level for seismic activity, thinking like maybe there could be like some kind of natural explanation because you can get strange balls of light when, there's things like that going around. The conditions that day are not what you would need to have that happen. Um, so that was my very first experience there. I have heard countless stories of other people having those types of experiences, specifically orbs, but also, ghosts, spirits, creatures, things like that. Um, but when it happened to me, I said, like, I was in a little bit of shock at first, and I
I
said, like,
bet.
I talk to people that see things like this. I don't see them myself. So, like, this can't be happening right now. So that was my very first experience. That was right on the Connecticut, Rhode Island border, way out in the woods.
What time of the day did you say it was?
It was probably late morning, but it was bright daylight, sunny day.
And how luminescent was this thing? Like you said, it was kind of like a light, right? The orb was kind of glowing. So was it very bright or?
So yeah, it was. The best way I can describe it is almost like it was like a solid light with kind of like a halo around it almost. So it was radiating light a little bit, I'd say, even in, middle of the day.
Wow. It's interesting that things like orbs often appear with so many or near so many different paranormal sites and different paranormal phenomena. So they're obviously attached to window areas, and sometimes they're attached to ancient sites. They're also attached to Bigfoot, and they're also associated with people who have alien abductions. And what's your type of approach, not just including your own encounter, which is fascinating, but what's your kind of opinion of orbs? Because they appear so often throughout the literature and throughout different stories.
To me, what it seems like is it's energy trying to manifest from wherever it is coming from. Whatever you think that energy is or wherever it comes from, it seems to be trying to manifest and like almost kind of cycling through either a light or a sound spectrum. So I saw red first and then it changed to orange. And there's other people, and after that, it was gone. But there's other people that have seen these lights kind of like cycle through the whole color spectrum, the Roy G. Biv, right in order. Before red on the color spectrum is infrared, which humans can't see, but some animals, like some dogs, can. And I think that is why, sometimes dogs are alerting us to paranormal activity because it's manifesting from a side of the spectrum that we can't either see or hear. Just like, the dog whistles as well. They can hear it. We can't. I think it's has something to do with either the light spectrum or sound spectrum. Sometimes it's both, sometimes it's one or the other. I didn't hear anything strange, but I have heard, people will hear a high pitched noise that then goes lower. And it always just seems to be kind of cycling through a spectrum, like it's trying to become visible to us almost.
I know John Keel talked about these things coming in and out of the type of, higher spectrum than human visibility that you talk about and changing colours. And he talked about a super spectrum, which was even above it. Interestingly, he also talked about quite extensively about pets and dogs being taken by these things. I wonder if sometimes they get taken so they can't alert us, or if sometimes they get taken because they see things that they're not meant to be seeing. It puts another spin on it when you mentioned that animals can see things that we can't.
Yeah, I don't like those stories personally. In the Mothman prophecies, you do have a couple of dogs involved in there, and those are really hard to hear. But I like to point out that in the Mothman prophecy, and I think it's fairly close to the beginning, Keel talks about someone was on the bank of the Ohio River looking out. They saw a red orb, red ball of light. And then afterwards, on the bank of the river, they saw he described it, I think, as a small humanoid on the bank of the river right after they had seen that orb. Uh, they seem to go hand in hand in the Bridgewater Triangle up in New England. They call them Taipei-Wonkas. So there's, it's prevalent enough for there to be a name for it. Other cultures call it a spook light or a ghost light. It does seem to happen everywhere and be just common throughout the world, not just here. But there's tons of stories of right after someone's seen that orb of light, whatever you want to call it, they then will have an encounter with some kind of creature. I was not that lucky. Just saw the orb, unfortunately.
It's interesting you mentioned people seeing creatures afterwards, because I know there's a number of accounts in the literature. And I think Eric Mintel, I hope he's the guest, I'm trying to remember who I had on recently, was talking about somebody seeing some type of humanoid entity in one of these, a bigger type, like maybe not a smaller orb, a bigger type orb. But I know there's a number of those kind of stories of big floating balls, and people see what looks like a figure almost, with its arms stretched out inside. I wonder if those manifestations people are catching these orbs when they're in the process of doing a transformation into something which appears to us more as a humanoid figure.
Yeah, a lot of people think that energy kind of manifests in a way that you're expecting it to, or what you're familiar with. Um, Not necessarily that it has a certain form, but it does seem like a lot of the times they are manifesting from somewhere.
Before we go along this fascinating route that we're traveling, we have a question from Horace, which touched on something we were talking about a little earlier. And Horace Smith, of course, is Professor Emeritus of Astronomy and Physics at Michigan State University, a good friend of my show, a good friend of your show. He's chatted to both of us on our shows, and he asks, large and distinctive rocks are often mentioned in early colonial records in New England. Does it seem to Susie that such mentions wane after the decline of strict Puritanism?
So I think that we really like our rocks in New England, but I do think that we have looked at them differently throughout history. So as an example, if any of viewers are from New Hampshire, the Old Man on the Mountain. It was like a profile rock, a cliff that looked like a profile. It is sadly no longer there. It fell a few years ago. But it's so sad to me. We used to go see that as a child. We'd drive up to New Hampshire just to see that. So you do have things like that, but unfortunately, the history of archaeology in New England is quite atrocious. Even it has gotten a little bit better, but even today, there are still archaeologists that say indigenous people didn't build with stone here. We know that's not true, but that's the narrative that's pushed. You also have people saying that some of these sites that are definitely indigenous were, built by the Celts or the Phoenicians and things like that. Just nobody, for whatever reason, wants to admit that they were built by indigenous people. And you have archaeologists in New England that will look at a site where you don't find evidence of daily life, which is normal for a ceremonial site. You don't live there. It's like a church. Like if you go to a church, you're not going to, find somebody's clothes and, stuff that you would in a home. But, in the Midwest, you'll have the same thing happen and they'll say, oh, it's a clean site. So it was ceremonial. In New England, they'll say, well, there's no Native American artifacts here, so it's not a Native American site. So to get back to Horace's point, I think it is still there. I just don't think that we look at it the same. as we once did here. I think that the Puritans would have had us forget everything, all of these sites. A lot of them have been destroyed. It wasn't too long ago they blew up the largest stone chamber in Massachusetts. It had an astronomical alignment to build a highway.
Gosh.
So I don't think we have the same reverence that we used to here. But I do think there are still a lot of people that are interested in these sites. And, we have things like there's a profile rock up near a sonnet in Massachusetts. We still go to some of these places. And, you have businesses in the area named after it. New Hampshire's highway signs, like for, Route 11, it has a picture of the old man in the mountain that I was talking about earlier. So we do still have it. I think we just don't truly appreciate them as much as we should, for sure.
Do you think, putting aside the discussion or putting aside the idea that these are somehow European or Middle Eastern, colonizers in, pre-Columbian times, does this suggest there were pre-Columbian civilizations which were indigenous, but kind of, I don't know, they moved or they were forgotten or they transformed? Because I know there's also talk about potentially links between, and this might also be equivalent levels of pseudo-history, I don't know, because it's not my area of expertise, but the idea that there might have been something similar to the Aztec Empire, or the Aztec Empire might have stretched north, or alternatively, what might have been an earlier empire stretched south and went down to where the Aztecs and the Mayans were. Do you have any ideas about anything like that?
It's made a little bit more simple in New England because we had the glaciers. So up until, a certain point in history, which is kind of debated, and I have mixed feelings on, exactly when that time was, but we do know there weren't people living here when we were covered in a glacier, for sure.
Oh, interesting.
But there's lots of speculation on what group of Europeans came here first. Was it the Phoenicians? Was it the Vikings? We know there are all kinds of outside cultures in New England for a very long time before the Pilgrims got here, before Columbus discovered the New World. There were people here, and New England was pretty cool before that too. We tend to think of it as like the Europeans got here and it was some kind of primordial forest. That was not the case at all. It was very much cultured land. They used to do controlled burns. It was a prairie, essentially. But there was also highways all over New England, trails that people traveled on a regular basis. People used to move around much more than we gave them credit for. So you have some of these highways are actually roads today. But they're also the connection between these stone sites and some of those ancient highways have paranormal activity today. So some of the, just the roads that people have been traveling on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, tend to hold on a little bit more, just like the ley lines in England we were talking about earlier.
It's interesting about the highways of today traveling similar routes. It made me think about the work of Eddie Lenihan, who is one of the great folklorists of Ireland, and he's one of the few people who've really tried to retain memories of the fairy faith in modern times. He went out when he was doing his studies at university, just studying language, probably multiple decades ago now, and he found out the people he spoke about in Ireland had stories about living memory encounters with the fair folk. That's just as an aside. The main point was that he spoke a number of times about when things like fairy forts or fairy trees have been demolished for roads. It's very bad news, just like we were talking about before when people build houses near these things, that often those roads will have more accidents on them or will have more problems on them. We see something similar in Iceland where often there's an attempt to avoid old fairy structures for fear that it will be bad luck for roads or for buildings. There's stories on these roads which have travelled either traditional routes or mowed through traditional structures. Are there stories of roads being particularly of bad luck or having more accidents than others anywhere in your area?
So there was actually this is one of my favorite parts of local history is the Mohegan tribe actually stopped development on a project to protect a stone wall that was said to be home of the Little People.
Wow.
So, and they successfully stopped it also, um, which is great. And this particular stone wall actually has these little, like almost windows in it. And those were said to be built so the little people could get through the walls.
That's amazing. That's so much like things we hear about with similar culture, with similar ideas in other cultures. So it's fascinating how these things permeate across the globe.
Yeah. And you have to wonder, like, is it some kind of psychological human instinct that we come up with these similar legends or folklore, or is it just that we have the same type of entities all over the place? My favorite example of that is you have the gnomes in Scandinavia that have the pointy red hats, but you also have the duendes in Central and South America that have pointy red hats. And also in the Philippines, their little people have pointy red hats. And it's just a very odd similarity to have.
It is very strange. I also know that there have been flying saucer reports with creatures that dress similarly to these type of entities in folklore, including pointy hats sometimes. So when you start to, I mean, I guess people could still say, well, maybe there's some psychological reason or sociological reason that we across the world ascribe pointy red hats to some of these humanoid entities. But there does, to me, seem to be something which is deeper than just a simple way to psychologize it away. We had a question from Bob Antone, who is a very good friend of mine, a good friend of Talking Weird, and always switched on, a researcher himself out in Washington State. He says, Susie, and I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce this, my Narragansett contact told me about petroglyph and ancient painted caves under public bridges throughout Connecticut and Rhode Island. Have you found these hunters' caves yet? Paranormal activity is meant to be there.
So I have found one. Now I'm interested if there's more around. So Bob and I will have to talk later. And you did a decent job pronouncing it. It's Narragansett.
Okay.
So you weren't far off. So kudos
Thank
to you
you
for that one. And yeah, there are the petroglyphs. There are still some around. There is a rune stone actually in Narragansett. That is pretty interesting. But yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily have to go to like one of the more famous sites. You can sometimes go out into the woods. There's so many stone structures in New England, you can just stumble over them sometimes. Um, I'm gonna have to start checking under more bridges though, apparently.
I wonder what it is about bridges, because obviously anyone even vaguely familiar with childhood folklore knows that trolls are meant to live under bridges. Maybe it's because it's a crossing or it's a liminal place or something. Who knows?
I was just gonna say liminal spaces, there might be something to that. I've heard a lot of encounters in the Bridgewater Triangle that always seem to be in liminal spaces. So it might just be the mindset that you're in those spaces too.
When you go to these places, which, as we've mentioned, often have an assumption, or not an assumption, a legend of there being an association with paranormal activity, are you concerned at all? Or maybe you're just out there hoping that you'll see something weird. But is there ever any concern for your safety? Because not just the shaver stuff that you and I joke about, but certainly things like David Paulides missing 411 and similar ways of looking at the paranormal suggest sometimes places where there are these type of hotspots and these type of repeated reports of things appearing can be potentially dangerous for people to visit or to go to.
Yep. So I have kind of my own theories on that, but I don't worry. I think other people worry about me. I know other people worry about me. But the way I feel about it is if anxiety and fear are extremely strong emotions, and if, for example, you are constantly worried about demons, you're scared of demons, those are the type of people that generally have demon possessions, right? It's not an atheist that gets possessed by a demon. It's someone that very strongly believes in that. And they have a lot of anxiety about it. They're very worried about it. Um, if you can kind of strip back everything that society has kind of told you about what the paranormal is, forget about the movies that you've watched and just look at it for what it is, make your own assumptions of it, and have a more balanced view, and have it not be all like good versus evil. This is where I differ from Shaver. He had, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. I think the supernatural is kind of it's an extension of nature, right? Just, natural things that we don't yet understand. Nature is not ever good or bad. It's not black and white. So, as an example, you have a documentary filmed from a perspective of a starving hawk when it swoops down and grabs a bunny. You're rooting for that hawk. When the documentary is filmed from the perspective of the bunny and that hawk swoops down and grabs it, that same hawk you were rooting for is now the bad guy. It's how nature is. What's good to one person is bad to another. All this to say that I think if you are not scared, you're not going to see scary things. If you're expecting something scary, you might get it kind of, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but also, like attracts like, and the energy you put out is kind of the energy you're going to get. And I could be completely wrong. And a month from now, everyone's going to be like, "Where's Susie? She's make documentaries and podcasts about me."
Yeah, I'll be putting my hand up to say you were taken by the Darrow. That'll be my guess.
I think if I ever did get taken, that's who you'd want to look for sure.
Oh, yeah. I hope it isn't the Darrow, because that would be the worst of all, those sadistic little buggers. Speaking of Shaver, though, because I know we both have an interest, and speaking of rock, so we can't leave him too far behind, because for those listeners who aren't regularly here with us, I'm fascinated with the Shaver mystery, and the latter part of it was Richard Shaver finding what he thought were rock books to prove his belief system that there was this pre-deluge civilization. In these rock books, he thought they weren't just simple rocks that he was digging out of the ground. He thought that somehow within them they contained images and messages from people in the distant past, again before the flood. Are there any things that you've found when you've been digging around or when you've been researching that you've thought might be a pre-deluge type artifact?
I can't say I specifically have. I do think that Shaver was onto something, though. I don't always agree with the conclusions he came to, but I do think he was experiencing or tapping into something. Um, and you also have other stories of the Fae folk, like Anne Jeffries. Are you familiar with that one? Um, she was a woman that claimed to be having adult encounters.
I'm not familiar, no.
Yeah, she was having these encounters with Fae folk. We're in a network, so I'm not going to go into detail about what those encounters were. But they were giving her this bread to eat also. And over time, she was said to develop healing powers, and she was still a devout member of her church at a time where it was, very frowned upon to do anything like that. Um, but there are instances of her healing, and also her giving her, I believe it was her brother, a piece of this bread that the fairies had given her. But when she was having these encounters she said she was in her room. She was physically there. But there are so many other things that happened that, like, lead you to believe something was going on. What, I don't know, but she was definitely not physically going out into the woods and having these encounters. So it's very similar to Shaver in that respect.
That is fascinating because, yes, Shaver did have an underground lover, a member of the Tero species, which were the good equivalents of the evil Dero. But of course, that not only the story you're mentioning, but it's a very common tale within various supernatural and paranormal and even ufological belief systems that somebody who's a human on this earth does take a lover from the other realm. And I think what perhaps is most interesting about what you talked about is if that woman was actually just in her room when she was meant to be off having those experiences. That's very much exactly like Shaver's claims when he said he was in the caves, but we know for most of that time he was actually in mental institutions, for example, which didn't bother his editor and friend Raymond Palmer because while Shaver said it was physical, Palmer just said, well, this is proof that it's somehow supernatural. He's still having these experiences, but it's closer to the version of reality which is described in the Bible Owaspi, which was this kind of pre-New Age Bible of the 19th century. So I do think those parallels are fascinating. And I think it's something that we should always be conscious of, that so many of these things that we talk about, whether it's fairy faith or whether it's UFO abductions or whether it's the Shaver mystery, that there are all these wonderful correlations going across the spectrum of many of these belief systems. Much of witchcraft or the hysteria around witchcraft was similar as well. These ideas that people would having demon or non-human lovers. We had a point here or a question from the Dead End Collective, and he asked you, Susie, did you ever read the famous book by Patrick Harpur, Demonic Reality?
I haven't. Have you, Dean?
Yeah, and I actually sent you a while ago and said, you need to read Demonic Reality. I think it was on a wall when we were chatting with all the books you had to read, and Steve Ward was giving you, like, just throwing all these books at you.
Yeah, you guys like to make me spend all of my money on books. But the Dead End Collective is not out to make me go broke, so I will take his suggestion.
No, I think Demonic Reality, to his point, is he's suggesting that it's a daemon the way it was spelt in Greek and not a demon. And as the Dead End Collective here, it's a manifestation of Earth that's connected in folklore. I think that is kind of it. Harper's point is that these things are interconnected, much the same way as what I just said before I brought that point up, or what people like Jacques Vallée and John Keel and Brad Steiger said long before I was even born. The suggestion that there is some type of correlation, or perhaps as Keel suggested, and Vallée kind of suggested as well, it's all actually a root. There's one phenomenon, and all these things we think of are different phenomena are just appearances of whatever this root source is. Patrick Harpur talks about it just with a slightly different twist. And I actually think Harper's book, Demonic Reality, so thank you for bringing it up, Dead End Collective, is as important as Keel's most important works or Vallée's most important works. It just perhaps hasn't been ingested as much in our community as Keel and Vallée has been, but it's equally important a work, and it's just fascinating. And Susie, you'd get an awful lot out of that book. Like, you're not going to read that and regret having dropped the, I don't know, $10 to $20 or whatever it is. Now, I think did I see another question from Horace for you here? I think I did. Here we go. Horace asks, how long do New England petroglyphs typically last before weather wears them away? That's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question, and it's a little bit of a sore subject. So there's a lot of controversy over dating some of these sites. There's also a site called Bellow Falls, It's in Vermont. It's really cool. It's a rock that has some people think they might be UFO pilots or aliens, but to me, they look like an emoji, like a smiley face. And it's on the rock by a river. And over time, people have come and, very well intended, I am sure, and kind of touched them up a little bit. And you can kind of see, um, you can see those kind of things. You can see the difference on the ones that haven't been touched or not. And the ones that haven't been touched are almost gone. It's also very hard to date rocks. And, I'm not going to harp on it too much, but back to the archaeological problems we have in New England. There is resistance to using some of the newer types of dating things like that because they don't give people the dates that they want. So they're going to say they're not accurate, and they want the more traditional things that might give you a wide range that could, fit your narrative that your site's 4,000 years old and built by the Phoenicians when it's, maybe 400 years old and was built by the local tribe in that area. Um, so I have seen petroglyphs with sites that have been dated back to be a minimum of 400 years. But you can't really there's no accurate way to tell for sure. If you're doing carbon dating, you're really just figuring out if there was a fire there at a certain time. Um, so it's just not an accurate way to date things. It gets really complicated when you're trying to date any kind of stone structure. But I think, the ones that we have left, we don't have much longer with them. Pretty soon, they'll probably all be gone.
While we're on the subject of petroglyphs, I know in things like ancient astronaut theory and even in Bigfoot research, I've seen people point at this type of often prehistoric artwork, or certainly pre-Columbian artwork, to suggest that it's indicating a UFO or an extraterrestrial or a Bigfoot or some other cryptid. Are there things in New England which are thought to perhaps represent something paranormal or anomalous in the art?
Um, hmm. I can't think the Bellow Falls ones that I mentioned earlier. Some people do think that those are depictions of aliens. Um, the a lot of the petroglyphs I've seen are maybe you could say would be more along the lines of a thunderbird. If you're going to try to connect it with the paranormal, or it could just be a regular big bird. So it's hard to say. I think, sometimes we want to force things into the paranormal corner that maybe don't fit there, but it could be. I can't really tell you if it is or it isn't. But I have seen a lot of bird petroglyphs.
Are there other window area type things attached to any of these other than things like orbs? Are there locations that you're familiar with which might coincide more often than others with some type of paranormal or cryptid or ufological appearance?
We've got all of those things. So there actually, I think, for UFOs specifically, the area in between two of the biggest stone sites I've looked into, or most common ones, it's the in between those two places that have the most UFO sightings, and not
Wow.
actually at one of the sites. But certainly there are Bigfoot sightings. There was actually a second site where I I'd say probably a paranormal experience at. Um, I went my camera battery drained, put a new battery in. When I went home that day, all of my videos and pictures were still there. Everything was fine. The next day they were all gone off of my
Gosh.
my phone and my digital camera. Um, and I myself was completely drained after that. And that area, after I had gone to that site, I had been talking to some little old men, local men that were fishing, just stopped, had a chat with them. And, they asked me what I was doing there. I explained it to them. And they said, "Oh, yeah. So you were like a mile away from where people see Bigfoot all the time."
Huh. Wow.
I, that was, that's the things that you get from going to these places and talking to locals. Little old men that are fishing are the best people to talk to if you want the local gossip.
Yeah, until they point you in a direction the Bigfoot takes you, or the Darrow take you. That might have been the Darrow's Tampa Rays messing with your camera, by the way. Just saying. We have a question for you from the Dead End Collective. Susie, do you feel these structured mounds form a pattern? If so, what does it mean?
So in New England, we don't have mounds. Those are in the Midwest. Here we have stone structures. So we have a lot of structures with astronomical alignments. So you'll have the opening of it that faces east, and then you'll usually have an opening in the west for sunset. You also have turtle effigies and snake effigies, and what would be called stone prayers, which is generally a boulder with a bunch of smaller rocks placed on it. Um, it I've heard it explained that indigenous people would put them there either kind of as a memorial to someone or something, or in the event that the stone prayer is facing a landmark, like, a mountain, you would put that stone there during a vision quest to get the power from that mountain. Um, so that is one of the theories, but I think I don't know that it matters anymore. I think what matters now is, just like the old churches in England and the roads in between them, you had wherever you have, prayer, you might have desperate people that are very emotional there, or, people deep in meditation. The energy from that is going to leave an imprint after it accumulates so long. Um, and what was the original intention might not be relevant to us. We're a different culture. It's a different time. But a lot of that, unfortunately was lost when, we massacred the indigenous people here. So we just don't have all of that knowledge. Um, but, turtles in particular are a very important part. North America is called Turtle Island. So that kind of represents creation. You could, speculate that was kind of an effigy built for, or to represent, or to honor the creator, and, go from there. But, a lot of that's just speculation on people. Um, if you have anything in your area, I would recommend just asking the tribe in that area what they say about it, because they're going to be the ones that know, if there are any left. That is, hopefully there are.
Is that something you often do? Do you go out and engage with the local tribe to find out what you should be looking at, or what areas are most significant? Or
Absolutely. I've been, you have to not only, talk to people, but you have to learn the culture of the tribe, the history of the tribe, to be even able to start to understand the folklore. Uh, and if you're like me and you want to go on your friend's podcasts and run your mouth, you should get permission from the tribal elders to do that as well. Um, and that will, it's really worth it. Learning about it is going to make things, start to connect, make more sense to you. And it's people want you to learn about their culture. They'll be happy to help you too, and point you. Like, I was talking about that site that I was following GPS coordinates to get to. I would never have found that site, if someone hadn't pointed me in that direction. And there's just, a wealth of knowledge that isn't written down, but there are still people that were told those stories from generations before them. And it's actually, quite amazing what people have in their brains.
Have you ever had warnings of not to go anywhere? Not necessarily for cultural, I guess for cultural sensitivity reasons, but for like, this is a bad area, you don't want to go there.
No, I haven't had that. What I did have was someone tell me they told someone else something like that because they didn't like them, uh, which was hilarious to me. But
Huh.
also, you're not helping my cause of trying to get to the point that these things aren't inherently evil. You're telling people they're scary not to go to the places.
And we had another question from the Dead End Collective, and he says, so what are ley lines? I don't know if he wants a textbook explanation or what the significance of them is, so maybe you can field it any way you want to, Susie.
I actually can, even, having researched, I still continuously ask that. I never take anyone's word for anything. So I want to kind of go figure things out for myself. And what I never understood was who is coming up, because you can Google, ley lines in New England and you'll find 10 different maps with different lines. And we said, like, who is the one coming up with these? And I think, sometimes it is people just making stuff up. So I just personally would not trust one you find on the internet. What I've done, and ley lines is just kind of a word we use because it's out in the zeitgeist, right? But what I would do is, if you're interested in finding ley lines in your area, start thinking, where have I heard stories of this activity happening? I literally got a map and started, just like in the movies, pinpoints in, each place. And, eventually you start to see these lines forming. I personally think it's human energy that is maybe drawing supernatural energy, or, helping things manifest from, again, wherever they manifest from, which that information I'm not privy to yet.
What are your plans going forward? Do you have many new locations you're looking for, or are there ones that you're on your wish list to hit, or what's some of the next stage in your research?
I've put a lot of miles on my car this year. I've hit a lot of them. I've hit, the more well-known ones. You know, as we're kind of running out of good weather this year, I'm trying to plan strategically, but I'd also like to go find maybe some lesser known sites. Um, Maybe head a little bit further north too before it gets too cold. Because the line I have plotted out right now does stop at a certain point, just because that's my normal driving range. So I might have to take some weekend trips, venture out a little bit further, see if that line goes any further up.
That sounds like so much fun. It's so good that you're always in the field checking these things out. Now, where can people keep tabs on what you're up to and find out your most recent investigations? And of course, so let them know maybe your blog site, but also let them know where they can get a hold of you on the High Strangeness Factor with Steve Ward and Andy Mercer.
Yep. So once a fortnight, we have the High Strangeness Factor. My co-hosts are Steve Ward and Andy Mercer, like Dean mentioned. Great people. Steve has a good background in anything John Keel, and Andy is a psychoanalyst with 30 plus years experience in the occult and paranormal investigations. So it's always a good time talking to those two. That's on the Paranormal UK radio network, but you can find it anywhere that podcasts are found. You can get a hold of me at pukwudgies.blogspot.com. There's a contact form there. And I've also recently started a YouTube channel that has mostly stone sites on it. Also, if I get upset about something, I might do an interview, because when I get upset about bad information out there, the first thing I do is get somebody that knows more about it than I do to come talk to me about it and get good information out there with me.
That's a great approach, actually. Great approach. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming on, Susie. It's always such a great delight to chat to you. So thank you for joining me tonight.
It was great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course, anytime. We'll have to get you back sometime soon again. And until I get to talk to you again, though, Susie, until I get to talk to everybody else out there, please keep it weird.